So good morning. I have put on the board just to remind everybody of the four eras, if you will, in the development of Rus, Kievan Rus. This is our, in a sense, last lecture on Kievan Rus. And of those four eras, as you can see, we'll be looking at, in large part, but not exclusively, the fourth of these eras called the era of transformation. This Kievan period in the history of Ukraine did not end with the sacking of Kyiv itself in 1169 by that prince from Vladimir Suzdal, Andrey Bogolyubsky, nor did it end, as is very often assumed to be the case, with the Mongol invasion that we spoke about last time with the sacking of the city of Kyiv in late 1240. Rather, the Kievan period, if you will, was to last for another century. Specifically in the western portion of present-day Ukrainian territory, where a powerful kingdom was established known as Galicia-Volhynia. Galicia-Volhynia. The boundaries of Galicia and Volhynia, like those of other lands of Rus, fluctuated throughout this entire period. But basically, Galicia, if we look at it first, was bounded by the Carpathian mountain ridges or crests in the south, more or less just south, or just west of the San River in the west. This line here, the red line on this map, and in the south, from there to the open steppe, and then in some cases beyond the open steppe, as we might see. But the core of Galicia is this, of medieval Galicia, is that area. Volhynia, the other Rus principality, literally just to the north of Galicia, the Bug River runs through the heart of it, we could say. Not quite as far west as the Vistula River, boundary on Poland. In the north, almost as far as the classic Lithuanian lands that we will speak about, and in the east, bordering on the principalities of Kyiv and Turau, Pinsk. Now, the early history of both Galicia and of Volhynia was, in many ways, similar to that of other lands in the Rus realm. Galicia, inhabited by a Slavic tribe, not clear what their origins were, still controversy. They were known as the White Croats, not dissimilar from the Croatians in the Balkans, because these White Croats, together with other Croats from north of the Carpathians, actually eventually migrated to the Balkans. Volhynia, by another East Slavic tribe called the Dulibians and the Buzians. These tribes, like other tribes in the very early Slavic period, established fortified places, those horody or horodishche, which we spoke about earlier in this sequence of lectures about Kyiv and Rus. And these horody, horodishche evolved into centers of trade and commerce. The most important of these in Galicia were Przemyśl, which you know on the San River, another place called Zvenihorod here. Most important, the actual town of Halich on the Dniester River. Sometime in the 10th century, the 900s, these centers, all of them, came under the hegemony of the Rus princes, senior princes in Kyiv, and who then assigned their offspring from within the Rurik dynasty to rule over these Galician fortified places. As in other parts of the Rus realm, Galicia and Volhynia experienced both periods of political stability, and that was made possible by powerful and charismatic princes in Kyiv, and then, not surprisingly, periods of internal conflict, civil war, interprincely strife. Also, the social structure, the economic life, and cultural patterns in both Galicia and in Volhynia were also largely similar to other areas of the Rus realm. There were some differences, however. There were some differences. And we can mention three of them. The first is physical location, territory. As you can see, Galicia and Volhynia, but we're speaking about for the moment, both were less often subjected to the attacks of the nomadic peoples from the east, who had much more easier access to Pereyaslav, Chernihiv, Kyiv itself. So both Galicia and Volhynia to the west were somewhat protected from the open steppe nomads. But on the other hand, both Galicia and Volhynia were susceptible to attacks from their western neighbors, western and southern neighbors. Poland directly to the west, and the Hungarian kingdom to the south on the other side of the Carpathians. And then later, as we're going to see, up in the north, a new rising power called Lithuania. Another kind of difference, if you will, that both principalities, but especially Galicia, were more densely populated than any of the other Rus lands. When we spoke about population density, it was very low throughout all of this enormous expanse of the Rus realm. The highest population was, in fact, in Galicia and then secondarily in Volhynia. Another factor of differentiation from the Rus realm, which is based in some part on the demographic factor that I've just mentioned, that combined with relative peace from the nomadic invaders from the east, this allowed for the growth of a prosperous agricultural economy, somewhat stable, and that in turn made possible the existence of a wealthy social stratum, which in the Kiev social structure were known as the boyars. And this is going to come up over and over again, the boyars. These are the large landowners whose both wealth, financial wealth, and political influence is based on owning and exploiting the land. And it just so happened that the princes, the rulers of these various cities and then Galicia as a whole, from the beginning tended to give more power to their princely retinues and then later to the landowning boyars, much more than had happened in other Rus lands. And as a result, the political power of the boyars was quite great, and that was subsequently to have, as we're going to see, disruptive consequences for developments, in particular in Galicia. A third factor of differentiation. Although Galicia and Volhynia had become part of the Eastern Christian world, like all of the other Rus lands, both these territories, Galicia and Volhynia, were bordered by Roman Catholic countries, Western Rite Roman Catholic countries, whether Poland directly to the west, or, as I said, the Hungarian kingdom to the southwest. And as a result of that, the influence of Roman Catholicism was to be felt more strongly than anywhere else in Kievan Rus. And that resulted in what has been described as, quote unquote, an amalgam of Byzantine and Western cultural influences. This is how the great historian Hrushevsky described the situation in Galicia in particular. As you notice, I keep saying Galicia and Volhynia. Why? Because Galicia and Volhynia each started off as separate Rus principalities that eventually were united, and therefore Galicia-Volhynia's development, or Galicia and Volhynia's development, can be viewed in two phases. And those two phases are marked by the year, or divided by the year 1199. So the first phase from the 980s to 1199, and the second phase from 1199 to 1340. First phase when they functioned as separate principalities. The second phase from 1199 as joint principality, and even, as we're going to see, raised to the level of a kingdom. Now, this initial pre-unification phase that began here, as we see in the 980s. This was when Galicia and Volhynia were brought into the larger sphere of Rus, specifically by that person very important in the era of consolidation, Volodymyr I, or the Great. Now, Volodymyr's interest in these Western Rus lands, still dominated at the time by the White Croat and Dulibian tribal unions. This was prompted, his interest, by the economic value of these lands. Both of them were located along the overland international trade route that connected Kyiv on the one hand, right through Volhynia and or Galicia, and then on to Krakow to reach Central Europe, or from the farthest western edge of Galicia and then crossing south across the mountains into the Hungarian kingdom and the Danubian basin. So trade routes are very important. Aside from that, Galicia was eventually to be valuable in its own right. Why? Because mines near the early cultural and political center Halich, mines there produced salt, not only an essential element in human diet, but as we know in medieval times, an invaluable means of preserving food. In fact, the very name Halich is derived from the European or the Indo-European word for salt, hal, We have other places, Hallstatt or Halle an der Saale in the middle of Germany. These are salt centers, so to speak. And so Galicia, with a G, is actually the Latin name derived from the Rus Ukrainian form Halicina, Halicina. In other words, Galicia was the land of salt. Now, during the first phase of Galicia and Volhynian history, the princes of each of these territories were frequently engaged in a struggle, and a struggle that derived from controversies over to whose sons these territories were assigned following the death of the Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, the second of those charismatic leaders during the period of consolidation. And Yaroslav the Wise had kind of left a testament trying to avoid civil war between his descendants, and that testament assigned the various lands of the Rus realm to his several sons. And in that context, he gave, or he assigned, Volhynia to his fifth son, a man named Ihor. On the other hand, Galicia was not mentioned at all in the testament. But in practice, Yaroslav did then assign Galicia to not his sons, but his grandson, a man named Rostislav. And that arrangement was then recognized, or formally recognized, by the other Rus princes at the Diet of Lübeck. We spoke about that during the period of consolidation, namely kind of place where the various Rus princes met from time to time, addressing issues such as the threat from the nomads, but also, in particular, the Pecheneg, the Polovtsians, and as also internal problems within Rus. And among those internal problems was to agree with this situation where Volhynia was assigned to Ihor and Galicia to the grandson, not the son, of Yaroslav the Wise. But as we know, Rus princes were not necessarily prone to abide by agreements that they concluded, and so it's not surprising that Ihor and his descendants of what became the Ihorevich dynasty in Volhynia continued to claim authority over what they considered a single Galician-Volhynian patrimony, and that patrimony was theirs. Now, despite those claims, the descendants of Rostislav, the Rostislavich dynasty, did manage throughout the 12th century, the 1100s, to maintain Galicia as, for all intents and purposes, an independent principality. And among its most important rulers was a man named Yaroslav Rostislavich, son of the part of the Rostislavich dynasty. Interesting. Yaroslav I was known as the Wise, the prince of all of the Rus lands. In Galicia, this Yaroslav of the Rostislavich dynasty became known as the Osmomysl, that is, the person with 8 minds. He was considered so intelligent, so talented, etc. And this Yaroslav Osmomysl, Yaroslav of 8 minds, helped realize Galicia's economic potential, extending its sphere of influence southward to almost as far as, well, to the Black Sea. There's a port here called Bilhorod, along where the Dniester flows into the Black Sea. And thanks largely to this Yaroslav of 8 Mines leadership, for nearly a century, from about 1160 to 1240, Galicia and Volhynia functioned as pivotal points in this east-west trade via Krakow to Central Europe. So this is when medieval Galicia was at its height. Of course, there was this ongoing dispute and sometimes military struggle between these two dynasties, the Ihoreviches in Volhynia and the Rostislaviches in Galicia. And both of the rulers of those dynasties did something that was also to have an impact on developments, particular in Galicia. But nonetheless, both very often invited the Hungarians from south of the Carpathians to come over the mountains to help them in their struggle against each other. So the Hungarians are drawn into Galician-Volhynian politics. Now, from the point of view of Hungary, which was one of the major medieval polities stretching not only within the entire Danubian basin surrounded by the Carpathians, but down as far as the Adriatic Sea. And so now well, let's expand a little farther, and we're being invited. So from their standpoint, they were not opposed to extending their political influence north of the Carpathian Mountains. Their presence was sporadic, ultimately short-lived, but long enough or often enough for the Hungarian kings to do something in the year 1189. Might seem like little, but we're going to see the implications of this later on in this course. In 1189, the rulers of Hungary proclaimed themselves kings of Galicia and Lodomeria. Lodomeria is the Latin name for Volhynia. On the one hand, this seems relatively insignificant, but that act subsequently proved useful to Hungary's future rulers, or the future rulers of Hungary. Why? Because 6 centuries later, in 1772, when the Habsburg rulers of Austria, and the Habsburgs by then were also kings of Hungary, they acquired the province of Galicia, also a small part of Volhynia, and they justified their acquisition as a legitimate re-annexation of territory that had been, quote unquote, occupied by Poland since the 14th century. And they based it on this claim of the Hungarian kings, or put into their title as kings of Galicia and Lodomeria. So much for that first phase, when these two provinces, principalities, are separate. 1199 begins the second phase. This is when Galicia's politically influential landowning social stratum, those boyars that I have mentioned, they're always arguing against their own prince. And what do? The boyars of Galicia invite the ruler of Volhynia, a man named Roman at the time. He's the ruler in Volhynia. They now invite him to rule as a single political entity, Galicia and Volhynia. Both principalities now were united, at least through the person of Roman, and they were to be ruled as a single political entity by his successors, which came to be the Romanovych dynasty. And that was to last the case until the very end of Galicia-Volhynia as an independent entity in the 1340s. Now this Roman, who had experience in Volhynia already, and previous to that he was the ruler of Novgorod up in the northern Rus city. Well, he not only founded this new dynasty, the Romanoviches, he also reversed the policy of his predecessors in Galicia, those Rostislaviches. He only ruled for 6 years, but on the one hand, he united Volhynia and Galicia through his person as prince. With regard to internal policies, Roman curbed the power of the landowning boyars. They're the ones who invited him, the Galician boyars, and now he sees that they're problematic, so he does reduce their influence. He expels any of them who are opposed to him. On the other hand, he promoted the interests of the urban population and the rural population. With regard to external politics, on the international front, he established an alliance with Poland. He held the Hungarians in check from the south. He defeated the Kyivan princes and their allies, the Polovtsians, who from time to time also made incursions to those Western Rus lands. And at one point, he even proclaimed himself Prince of Kyiv. All of this, as you can see, is at the outset of the 13th century, the very first years of the 1200s. And this was a time already the city of Kyiv was beginning to lose its appeal as a political center. And so just like Andrey Bogolyubsky in 1169 from Vladimir Suzdal, so now Roman, even though he conquers Kyiv, he decides not to remain there, but to rule much of the southern Rus lands from his more prosperous capital of Halych in the center of Galicia. Toward the end of his short career, Roman's relations with the Poles, his western neighbors, deteriorated. In fact, he was killed in battle with them in 1205. Now, Roman's death in 1205 did come unexpectedly. He left his wife and their 2 infant sons, one of whom was named Danylo, but they were infants, so they couldn't rule. And what do we have? The short reign of Roman presaged and was the beginning of what often happens in the Rus lands, a period of internal struggle for power among various princes, and in this case, then the boyars as well. This short reign of Roman, though, also presaged another stage in the history of Eastern Europe after the decline of Kyiv. Having united much of Western Rus territory into one unit and creating internal stability which allowed his principality's economy to prosper, Roman set Galicia-Volhynia on a path that promised to make it, alongside Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast and Novgorod in the far north, to make Galicia-Volhynia now the third leading power to evolve out of the lands of Rus. This new role for Galicia-Volhynia was not to begin, however, so soon. Why? Because of Roman's untimely death in 1205. As I said, it ushered in a period of civil war, external invasions. That was to last for almost 4 decades, 40 years. Those decades, accompanied by a complicated series of events, can't go into the detail, overall internal rivalry between the princes who are claiming the throne, the Romanovich dynasty, and those boyars. And added to that are frequent foreign invasions. often at the invitation of the Galicians and Volhynian princes themselves. But without going into detail, there are a few general characteristics that both define and explain the context for these complicated events during the first half of the 13th century after Roman's death. And these characteristics have to do with what became a kind of political program for Galicia's landowning boyars that may be summed up under four principles. One, not to allow the establishment of any kind of permanent Rus dynasty in the principality, which means they're opposed then to the Romanovych dynasty. Second, to block especially Roman's infant son, who is now growing up, this Danylo, who was popular among the general population of Galicia. And three, instead to put up various pretenders to the princely throne and thereby weaken the prestige of the position. And four, to, yes, have a prince, but to allow his role to be at best nominal. Real power resting in the hands of whom? These landowning boyars. So that was the overall kind of their goals in their program, if you will. All the while, Danylo began in this period as being 5 years old in 1205, but he had grown to manhood. In fact, he tried twice to regain his throne in the 1230s, unsuccessfully. This Danylo had already become known well beyond Galicia for his courageous participation in that first battle during the expeditionary force of the Mongols. Remember, we spoke about that in 1223 at the river Kalka. Well, Danylo, the young Danylo, was leading the armies of Galicia. And he survives and he returns to Halych, where he eventually is going to occupy the princely throne. And that happens in the year 1238. And for the next quarter of a century, he was to remain the ruler of what is now a reunited Galician-Volhynian realm. Of course, this is 1238. The Mongols are already in Rus. They're raiding the northern Rus principalities during the winter of 1237, 1238. And so while the Mongols are doing that in northern Rus lands, Danylo was uniting his own patrimony. He even took control of the city of Kyiv on the eve of the Mongol attack in late 1240. Danylo was also able to eliminate Poland and Hungary, as well as Lithuania in the north, from further interference in Galician affairs. And in order to restore prosperity in his realm, after the ravages of those civil wars over 40 years between the various princes, pretenders, and the boyars, and the foreign invasions, now, in a more stable environment, Danylo began a systematic policy of inviting foreigners, especially Armenians, Germans, Jews, Poles, to settle in his realm, in particular in the urban areas. So Lviv and many other cities become centers for these various non-Slavic peoples, remnants of whom are still in these cities as almost until today. But in those years, they brought their more highly advanced artisan and commercial skills. He also fortified in Volhynia the castle at Lutsk, very important way station along the trade route from Kyiv to Central Europe. He founded the city of Lviv, northwest of Halich in Galicia. The result of this peace and stability also made possible a renewal of Galicia's salt trade and the principality's role as a now commercial emporium between Eastern Europe on the one hand and Central Europe on the other. Now, although he never acknowledged it, Danylo was actually helped in his activity by the Mongols. Helped by the Mongols. After the great Mongol leader Batu, as we saw last time, returned from Eastern Europe to Mongolia to participate in the elections of a new Khan, and then he comes back and he settles in that place that the Mongols set up at the mouth of the Volga River called Sarai. And it was from there that the Mongol Khan turned his attention to establishing administrative control over the eastern realm or Eastern Europe, or the western realm of the Mongol Empire, Eastern Europe. In 1245, Khan Batu demanded that Danylo appear before him to pay his obeisance. Remember, the Mongols are not destroying. They'll deal with the princes as long as they pay their taxes, their tribute, and from time to time come and pay their respects to the ultimate ruler now of this world, the Khan of the Golden Horde at Sarai. So now Danylo is expected to do this. Now, the Khan was aware of Danylo's bravery in the battle against his own Mongols at the river Khalkha, and he was also aware of Danylo's firm control over Galicia and Volhynia. This is the kind of person the Mongols can deal with. And so Danylo was actually treated with great respect, even though he had to pledge himself a vassal of the Mongol Khan and bow down and hit his head on the ground. In fact, the chronicles, the Galician chronicles from that era, to quote, "Oh, more evil than evil itself is the Tatar honor. Danylo, the great prince, the lord of the Rus land, now kneels and calls himself the Khan's slave." This is how the Rus view this in totally negative terms. But for their part, the Mongols approved of Danylo's rule in Galicia-Volhynia, and because of this, the Poles and the Hungarians that had just been invaded by the Mongols were now impressed that, oh, wait a minute, look at the Mongols have this guy Danylo, they respect him, so we better be careful. Danylo was even given complete control for collecting the Mongol tribute. That function normally was carried out by personal representatives of the Khan in lands under his control. But now this kind of very great service or privilege is entrusted to Danylo. And so what Danylo perceived as humiliation, others, in particular his Western rivals, Poland and Hungary, viewed as a great political victory. In retrospect, Danylo's decision to submit to the Mongols was an important factor in assuring Galicia-Volhynia's strength and prosperity. But Danylo still remained dissatisfied. And so after all of this, he almost immediately made plans for a crusade against the Mongols, or what was coming to be known as the Tatar yoke. His strategy was first to engage other European powers, especially Western ones, in his planned campaign. And so he turned to his former enemies, Hungary, Poland, the Lithuanians in the north. They became allies, mostly through marriage alliances. He also negotiated with the Vatican between the years 1245 and 1248. And the result of those negotiations was that in return for promising to promote Roman Catholicism in his Orthodox Rus lands, not convert, but at least to allow Roman Catholicism to function, in return for that, the Pope sent a delegate to crown Danylo in 1253 King of Rus, Rex Rusea. And by this act, Danylo was recognized as a full-fledged monarch in the context of the Western European feudal order, the only Rus prince to have attained that. Now, while all this was going on, the Mongols started to become suspicious of Danylo's foreign policy moves, and they began fomenting discontent, among whom, well, the Rus boyars, they haven't gone away in Galicia, and a lot of them in particular now opposed Danylo's quote-unquote Roman Catholic orientation. There was even a small uprising against his rule put down. Mongol troops start invading and attacking some of his lands in the east. They raided freely also throughout Galicia and Volhynia. So Danylo was put on notice. And disheartened by the lack of support in the West for his anti-Mongol crusade, and upset, he then repudiates any further Roman Catholic influence in his realm, and now faced with the prospect that he had to remain a vassal of the Mongol Khan of the Golden Horde. A now disheartened Danylo dies in 1264. We should reiterate, however, that this policy of submission to the Mongols, which Danylo himself personally despised, at the time did make it possible for his realm to prosper during most of his reign, so that next to Vladimir, Suzdal, and Novgorod in the north, Galicia-Volhynia was one of the three leading Rus states to evolve from the Kievan Federation. This long reign of Danylo was followed by an even longer reign by his son, a man named Lev, for the rest of the 13th century. Under Lev, Galicia-Volhynia was marked by a renewal of stability that had, as we saw, begun to break down during the last years of Danylo's rule. That's because Lev did fulfill his duties, responsibilities vis-a-vis the Mongol Khan, and also because he maintained an alliance with Hungary. It was also during Lev's reign that the city of Lviv, which Danylo, his father, had created, it now was made the capital of the Galician kingdom. So no longer Halych or Chelm or wherever else, but Lviv. Now the prestige that the Galician-Volhynian kingdom had attained was also reflected in ecclesiastical matters or church affairs. We've seen throughout this course the role of religion and the role of church, and is exceedingly important and remains important. Following in the Byzantine tradition from where Rus received Christianity, as in Byzantium, the Rus church remained largely subservient to the secular princely authorities, something totally different from the Western Roman Catholic world, where the Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican were political as well as religious power in themselves. This is not the case in the Eastern world. Also, it was not long before the concept developed in which it was understood that being a person from the realm of Rus also meant that he or she was of the Orthodox faith. And so territorial and religious identities were merged. In other words, one was of the Rus land because one was of the Rus faith, and vice versa. This convergence of religious and territorial, or to use a more modern concept, national identities, was of particular importance in Galicia-Volhynia, which of course bordered on non-Orthodox, that is, Roman Catholic countries. Now both Danylo, and his son Lev realized the prestige that came with the control of a city, which at the same time was the seat of a bishop, or better still, the seat of a metropolitan, that is the head of the entire Rus church. Now the head of the Rus church was in was in Kyiv. But after the Mongol invasion, the metropolitan of the Rus church moves from Kyiv, first temporarily, but then in 1299 permanently, to the northern principality of Vladimir Suzdal, eventually taking up residence in Moscow. And so, what does Lev do? He convinces the authorities 6 eparchies are taken from the authority of the Kyiv metropolitan, and a new distinct Galician metropolitan church is established, with its seat in the old capital of Halych. So now the symbolic presence of a metropolitan of a distinct Rus church is in Galicia. And yet, no sooner had Galicia-Volhynia attained the height of its political, its economic, and its religious influence, that now it entered into a period of decline. Its last 2 Romanovych kings, ruling in the first 2 decades of the 14th century, they initiated an anti-Mongol policy, result disastrous. The country's last ruler, a Roman Catholic prince from Poland, was poisoned in 1340, most likely by Galicia's politically influential aristocratic landowners, those boyars. The boyars then offer the throne of Galicia to a prince from Lithuania, but he's challenged by Hungary and by Poland. Poland invades Galicia in 1340 under its very powerful king Casimir III, and enter a next half-century of wars between Lithuania, Hungary, and Poland for control of this former Rus kingdom. After 1349, when the Polish forces are almost completely successful, it's really then in 1349 that the era of Kievan Rus finally came to an end in Ukrainian lands. From then on, those Ukrainian territories that were not already under the control of the Golden Horde in the south were within 4 decades to become part either of Poland or be annexed by the newest state that was soon to dominate Eastern Europe, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. A new era clearly was about to begin, so that for the next 4 centuries, the destiny of Ukrainian lands was to be determined by 3 new powers in Eastern Europe: the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Kingdom of Poland, and the successor state to the Golden Horde, the Crimean Khanate. And it is to this new era and these 3 entities that we are now going to turn after having completed our discussion of the Rus era in the history of Ukraine. Thank you.